Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Mr. John Gunnison and I are back at it again. And today's show, we are going to be focusing on potential normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. There's been some historic developments lately, specifically in the first ever public visit by an Israel minister to the Arab Kingdom. The Israeli tourism minister attended a multilateral tourism conference set up by the United Nations. And then simultaneously, the Saudi ambassador to the Palestinians traveled through an Israeli border checkpoint to visit the West Bank. That's just setting the table for a lot of developments that have been ongoing for a couple months now on the potential negotiations between these two to eventually normalize relations. So I guess, Mr. Gunnison, let's start off with the biggest question that I have in my mind. Why should we care? Why should listeners in America care about potential normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel? Because my understanding is these two countries aren't at conflict, so it wouldn't be stopping any type of direct war.
Yeah, Justin, I think that that's actually quite accurate. This phase of normalization agreements between Israel and some Arabic-speaking countries have been characterized in the media and by political figures as being peace deals or peace initiatives. And just like you've suggested, I think that that is perhaps a bit misleading because these countries are really not in a state of conflict with Israel and in fact have been moving on a pretty linear trajectory of normalization and the warming of ties really since the Arab Spring events in 2011. So would an Israeli-Saudi normalization really impact the lives of Americans? Not directly on its own. The state of relations in the Middle East would not necessarily be that affected by a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia because the direction of travel is already headed there. However, the United States have become a factor and a player in this progress. And there has been a lot of talk about commitments that the United States might make in order to push the final normalization between these two countries over the line. And in that case, we would see commitments, concessions made by American policymakers that would very much impact the lives of ordinary Americans.
It would be a grand bargain and create a tectonic shift in the Middle East. Israel and Saudi Arabia have never had diplomatic relations, but today both countries' leaders appear to want normalization, and the U.S. is actively negotiating its details. The broad outline would be this. The U.S. provides Saudi Arabia security guarantees, civil nuclear technology with enrichment, and advanced weapons. And Israel provides what officials describe as, quote, meaningful concessions to the Palestinians.
So, John, before diving into concessions that the U.S. might make, what we might receive in return, then even getting into the political ramifications, if this is something that should go through the Senate, what that means politically, practically, heading into an election. Before we get into all those juicy topics, let's get into more specifically the region itself and what this means for, obviously, Israel and Saudi Arabia, but maybe peace in the region more generally and more abstract. It sounds like that this would be some type of positive development that maybe could be a building block.
Well, it really it depends on a few things. So first, let's explain why Saudi Arabia and Israel might be headed in this direction. Like we alluded to, they've been on this path really since 2011. So in the last decade, the security interests and the political interests between Israel and Saudi Arabia have kind of converged. The year 2011 is a big year that looms really large in Middle East history. And that's because of revolutions that came about in several Arabic-speaking countries called the Arab Spring. The first one was in Tunisia, then it spread into Egypt. There were civil wars in Libya and Syria as a consequence of rebellions and revolts that happened there. There was the attempt to overthrow the royal family in Bahrain, a kingdom in the Arabian Gulf region. The latter was probably the one that really struck home for countries like Saudi Arabia. All of these events concerned the Saudis because they became worried that their own system, their own regime was at risk to a public revolt. Seeing Arabic-speaking countries attempt to overthrow dictators that they've had for a long time was concerning, but especially a revolution that happened, an attempted revolution that happened in this tiny little kingdom that resembles Saudi kingdom in a lot of key ways, right off the coast of Saudi Arabia. All of this got Saudi Arabia very concerned about the spread of political Islam in the region. They were also worried that the Iranians were encouraging these revolutions to occur in some of the instances, like in Bahrain. The war in Iraq made Iran a big player in Iraq. The civil war in Syria made Iran a big player in that country as they supported the leader, Bashar al-Assad, as he attempted to hold on to power. Iran have become a big player in Lebanon, and the Iranians were believed to have encouraged the potential revolution in Bahrain and the revolution in Yemen, two countries that border Saudi Arabia directly. So the concern about the spread of political Islam and the concern about the Iranian influence in the region and its growing presence in all these Arabic-speaking countries got the Saudis to start looking at the political and security picture in a way that's not that different from how the Israelis look at things. If you ask the Israelis what their biggest security concerns would be, they would say that Islamist terrorism and the influence of Iran are very high on that list. So all of this got the two countries kind of thinking in similar ways, sharing a lot of the same concerns, sharing a lot of the same rivals. And it became kind of inevitable that there would be a convergence in their political interests and trajectory. There has been a lot of speculation, even some real evidence that the two countries have been kind of working together and cooperating behind the scenes. The Israelis have been reaching out to countries that have a similar political outlook as the Saudis to exchange ambassadors and normalize. So they are very much headed in this direction.
So you just mentioned and outlined a lot of, regional circumstances that have created maybe a more similar shared view of security policy and diplomatic relations in the region for these two countries moving forward. And we have a quote from MBS on Fox News. Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, said in an interview last week that the talk of normalization is for the first time real, and every day we get closer.
We hope that it will reach a place that it will ease the life of the Palestinians and get Israel back as a player in the Middle East.
There were reports that you had suspended talks.
No, that's not true.
Not true. So you think, if you were to characterize it, are you close?
Every day we get closer.
My question is, how much of a potential deal rests upon Netanyahu and MBS getting along, whether it be Netanyahu's rather hawkish stance on Iran, the seemingly different values that he has from other Israeli leaders vis-a-vis democracy. He's not really big on it, and he's trying to centralize authority through a bunch of reforms to their justice system based on previous guests we've had. And then MBS, it seems like there hasn't been much work on his part to help and assist the Palestinians. So from your perspective, is there a relationship between these two? Is there more shared values than Saudi Arabia and Israeli leaders have had in the past? Or is it just these two happen to be the current rulers where the circumstances that you've outlined have kind of pushed the deal into a potential place where it's now more real than it has ever been?
Yeah, so Prince Mohammed and Netanyahu, they share an outlook for the reasons that you mentioned. We were talking a lot about their position on Iran. Also, you mentioned that Netanyahu has this anti-democratic character, especially in his current government and the agenda that he's been promoting domestically. This, of course, is something that doesn't bother Prince Mohammed at all. Prince Mohammed is, like you said, the de facto leader of a country that's really a autocratic country. It's an absolute monarchy, and it's become more concentrated autocratic system under Prince Mohammed. In the previous era, it remained a monarchy, but it was a bit more spread out. There were more stakeholders in the Saudi system. The religious authorities had a big voice. There were a lot of princes. There's thousands of princes in Saudi Arabia because the founder of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud, had so many children. He had about 60 children. So there's thousands of princes in Saudi Arabia, and many of them were big stakeholders in the Saudi system. It was almost more like an oligarchy than what it is now. And Prince Mohammed has been concentrating power in the office that he holds, and that's brought Saudi Arabia into a more autocratic direction. At the same time, it's become more secular because of how it's marginalized the religious leaders and so on. So he doesn't object to the centralization of power that Netanyahu has been attempting in his own country, of course. But why did Prince Mohammed say this in an interview with Bret Baier? I think that it was not only to signal to the Israelis his own position, but it was also to signal to the American audience that would be watching that program. Prince Mohammed, since 2018, has been a bit of a pariah in the United States. This is especially because of the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, a writer and media figure who was very prominent in Saudi Arabia, but also in the West. He had a column at the Washington Post, and as many listeners will remember, he was assassinated inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. This was a game changer in the way people in the West, especially the United States, perceive Prince Mohammed. And the prince, who had just a year before been toasted on a visit to the United States, hasn't returned to the United States since. So he's been trying to rebuild his perception, his reputation in America. And one way in which he can do this is signal his interest in making a deal with the Israelis, knowing that the Israelis are popular in the United States. Many Americans are committed to the security and defense of Israel and hold the U.S.-Israeli partnership in high regard. So it makes sense that when speaking to an American audience, Prince Mohammed would emphasize the possibility of this deal. It's one of the primary avenues in which he's tried to rebuild his relationship with the United States and kind of turn the table and start asking for some favors and concessions from the American side, something that he really wasn't in a position to do just a few years before.
What type of concessions would Prince Mohammed be willing to give up to Israel? Is it primarily he is willing to spend political capital and go through what might be, and maybe, correct me if I'm wrong here, John, maybe it's going to be fully supported by the public and religious factions within Saudi Arabia, but is the concessions primarily from MBS that he's willing to normalize with a country that may not be seen as being a popular move at the grassroots level in Saudi Arabia? Because to me, it looks very obvious from the reports that we've read that MBS wants from Israel greater support for Palestinians. So not necessarily the establishment of a state, but potentially more money, for example, for the Palestinian Authority to, as MBS was quoted as saying, ease the life of Palestinians. So that seems pretty obvious. There should be some type of concession on Palestinians by Israel, but what is Saudi Arabia giving up to move the ball forward here?
Yeah, so that's a pretty good question, because we're talking about a three-way deal in which the United States makes significant concessions, the Israelis maybe make some concessions, and the Saudis, it seems, would make the fewest concessions, right? Really, all that's being asked of the Saudis in the big headline pieces of this potential deal is that the Saudis would recognize the Israeli state, maybe exchange ambassadors, establish some kind of normal trade relations, maybe have direct flights between Ben Gurion Airport in Israel and major Saudi cities like Riyadh and Jeddah. These don't seem like huge concessions, right? But the symbolic importance of Saudi Arabia taking these steps does mean something in the Arabic-speaking world and also in the broader Muslim world. And why is that? It's because Saudi Arabia are the largest economy in the Arabic-speaking world. They've become the biggest market, and they've been demonstrating a lot of power. They've become kind of a pillar of the region for this reason in the last stretch of time, as they've surpassed Egypt as kind of the leading Arab power. They are also the custodian of the two holy mosques. And this gives them a pretty significant presence, not just in the Arabic-speaking world, but in the broader Muslim world, because the holy cities of Mecca and Medina are both in Saudi Arabia. And the two mosques that are considered the most holy and important mosques in the entire Islamic faith system are in these two cities. The Saudis are responsible for keeping these mosques secure. They're known as the custodians of the mosques. And Muslims who, as part of their religious tradition, have to travel on a pilgrimage at least once in their life during what's called the Hajj. It can also be called the Umrah if you don't go during the Hajj part of the year, but you go to a different time of the year. That means traveling to Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis, they have this symbolic importance in the Muslim world. And because the Israeli-Arab conflict does have a bit of a religious character to it, that means that the leading Muslim country, because of their custodianship, making this recognition of the Israelis would mean a lot. It also means that there's some political risks that the country would be taking by taking this step, because the Israelis remain very unpopular, not only in the Arabic-speaking world, but also the broader Muslim world. Normalization deals with the Israelis have proven very unpopular in the countries where they've already occurred, like the United Arab Emirates, Sudan, and so on. The Saudis have a population that is majority Arab and majority Muslim. That makes them different from a country like the United Arab Emirates, which previously normalized with Israel. So they have a population that on a broader scale would be rejecting this kind of deal. So it comes with these risks and this symbolic importance. That said, again, we've noted how they have been moving in this direction. It seems kind of inevitable to us. It might seem so to many people that the move would have more symbolic importance for. And also, Prince Mohammed himself is very popular in Saudi Arabia. So there is a bit of trust in him and the decisions that he makes. And it's possible that by taking this step, he could move public opinion. But that's really what the Israelis are looking for.
Could this potential deal, normalization agreement, usher in greater support in countries like the UAE and other countries that have already gone through the process to almost act as, I don't want to say cement, but almost some type of glue to put these deals on a stronger foundation as we move forward? Because it sounds like a lot of the concessions made by Saudi Arabia would be in political capital, in perception, almost similar to their sports washing efforts in the United States, but much more direct and probably much more impactful. Is there an assumption from the Israeli side and from the United States side that moving forward, there would be some type of ongoing shadow diplomacy where Saudi Arabia was working to help Israel normalize ties with maybe some other countries that have more problematic relations? So basically, it's an investment in today to shore up what we've already done, but also to bring in more fruits in the effort tomorrow.
So the process of Israeli integration into the Middle East, especially with Arabic-speaking countries, has been a long one, and it's been piece at a time. It's been kind of, I don't know if you could quite call it a domino effect, but it has been in stages. So the most important normalization deals and recognition deals that the Israelis have made, and this remains true today, no matter how much hype you hear about the so-called Abraham Accords, the most important deals that they made were with their neighbors. So that's Jordan and Egypt. These were real landmark deals. These deals were much more important, much more significant than the deals with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain during the Trump presidency, because these countries were actually at war with the Israelis. They had real conflict with the Israelis. They had territorial conflict with the Israelis. The Israelis were occupying a significant part of Egyptian territory at the time of the Camp David Accords, right? They were occupying the peninsula. A strategic and symbolically important part of the Egyptian state was being occupied by the Israeli army. They were really in a state of war and conflict. So those deals that they made were very, very significant ones. And again, kind of as we were saying before, at the time, Egypt were the leading power in the Arab world. So it was very significant for that reason as well. So those were the first, that was kind of, the first and most important step. More recently, they've made these deals with countries, again, that they were not in conflict with, being especially the United Arab Emirates. That was the most kind of substantive of the normalization deals that they made during the Trump presidency, but also with a few other Arabic-speaking countries, Bahrain, which we talked about before, a very small island country near Saudi Arabia, Sudan. That deal has had some pretty unfortunate ramifications, I think, because it helped elevate the Sudanese military at a time when Sudan was going through a political transition and there was hope for a new Sudanese democracy. So the impact of that deal it was probably not a peaceful one. It was not one that really benefited probably the stability of the region, but it did help elevate some military elites inside of Sudan. And then Morocco, which is, it's not a Middle Eastern country. It's an Arabic speaking country, but it's not really part of the Middle East region. And it has very little effect on what happens in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. It did matter for North Africa because of the effect that it had on the relationship with Algeria and the Western Sahara issue. And again, in that regard, it was probably not a peace deal. It was probably more of a war deal, but it did not have a huge ramification in the part of the world that we're talking about now, the Middle East. So if Saudi Arabia were to take this step, that would be another big domino to fall. It would be a significant win for the Israelis at getting another major Arabic-speaking country to recognize them. And for the reason that we mentioned, the country that is probably right now the most significant and important of all of the Arabic-speaking countries. And would it lead to future normalizations? I think perhaps. I don't know if it would necessarily happen right away, but some of the countries that Israel would be looking to next might include Qatar, Oman, Kuwait. These countries, it's not clear that they would immediately follow Saudi Arabia's lead. These countries are today more religious, more conservative. The Kuwaiti system also includes some elements of democracy, which means that they can't make a normalization deal purely because the king wants to. But these countries would be kind of the next ones on the list for the Israelis. And there would be momentum in that direction because of the move taken by this significant leading Arabic-speaking country. But we would absolutely not expect for it to happen overnight. And there would have to be more work done in that direction. I think that especially Qatar and Kuwait, you could see them taking quite a bit of time to take this step. They've demonstrated a bit of independence in how they orient themselves and have, in fact, been in political and diplomatic conflict with the Saudis in recent years.
Peace between Saudi Arabia and Israel would be a big deal. It would help create a circumstance in which the countries of the region could collaborate on everything from economics to technology to regional security. And that would benefit the United States of America in a fundamental way because we have an interest in a more integrated, more stable Middle East where de-escalation as opposed to escalation is the order of the day.
So, John, that brings us to the United States aspect of this potential agreement, normalization, deal, whatever you want to call it. I think before we get into potential concessions, we should really go back again and underline why this is important to the United States. Maybe some listeners might ask the question, we have Russia invading Ukraine and a new emphasis on U.S.-European ties. We have a rising China, where the United States, since President Obama's second term, has been trying to pivot to the Asia Pacific. Why should the United States spend so much sweat equity on a region that seemingly, based on what our politicians are messaging, appears to be somewhat in the back seat and not as relevant, not as front line as an ongoing hot war and the rise of another empire that is trying to replace the United States as a global hegemon?
Let me start by saying that in recent years, under Prince Mohammed, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have been pursuing a more multipolar approach to global affairs. The Saudis, they've had some diplomatic issues and disagreements with the United States in the past, but they have generally been oriented on the U.S. side of a lot of major global positions. During the Cold War, certainly the Saudis were very anti-communist and had a very negative relationship with the Soviet Union and were very much on the side of the West during that period. Of course, like I said, it wasn't always smooth sailing. We had the 1970s oil crisis, but when it came to conflict with these great powers, Saudi Arabia was generally a U.S. partner, for sure. But in the last few years, the Saudis have been suggesting that they're not necessarily part of a U.S.-led bloc. They've been signaling this in various ways. They've been partnering extensively on economic matters with the Chinese. Their position on the Ukraine war has not been quite as reliable as the U.S. had hoped. They've generally backed the U.S. position and the Ukrainian position in the United Nations, but they've also not put in place the similar sanctions to what the United States have. The United Arab Emirates, the neighbor of Saudi Arabia. They've been probably an even more difficult actor during the Ukraine matter, and the U.S. have started really looking at them much more critically because of how they've been acting as a conduit for a lot of Russian economic activity. So the U.S. have become concerned that these countries are spinning outside of the American orbit. One event that happened recently was the deal that the Saudis made with Iran to try to renormalize their relations. And that deal was reached under a Chinese forum. They might have even signed some of that agreement inside of Beijing. The Chinese announced the normalization of Saudi-Iranian relations together with them and acted as the mediator, they said. I do want to note that those negotiations didn't start in China. They actually started in Iraq. I think that the Iraqi government have been getting a lot less credit for their role in that than they probably deserve. But the Chinese role ended up becoming at least a publicly significant one. And it did raise to the attention of the U.S. that the Saudis were going to work with China on some political issues and security issues, not only on economic issues. So the United States are interested in pursuing this three-way deal with Saudi Arabia and Israel, not only because of the interest in seeing those two countries normalize, but also maybe to firm up Saudi Arabia's standing in the world picture as being aligned with the United States, rather than this kind of multipolar approach that they've been taking recently. So the U.S. Security, political interests are very much woven into this for that reason.
So I guess the follow-up, and I do want to get into the concessions because they're fascinating in the political process, but the follow-up here is MBS a reliable partner where the United States can go through a process of giving up potentially major concessions with the understanding that this is a guy who murdered journalists and then lied to our faces about it, but also has very close ties to the Trump family, former Trump administration, to the point where he potentially bribed Jared Kushner. All the evidence appears to show it was cash payment for political influence kind of exchange here. And leading into the midterms, there were reports, whether you agree or not with them, there were reports, though, and allegations leveled by the Biden administration that Saudi Arabia was trying to drive up oil prices to help Republicans at the polls. So fundamentally, do we have enough trust in the current regime in Saudi Arabia to move ahead with an agreement and feel comfortable that any agreement we've moved ahead on specifically ironing out these larger issues that you point to that are very important to us, that it'll be upheld?
Yeah, I think that that's kind of a big question. It's a great question because that's something that the United States really have to think through, not only because Prince Mohammed is the de facto leader of the country now, but because he likely will be leading the country for decades to come. He's quite a young man. He's a millennial like us. He represents a completely new generation of leadership in that country, a country that's been led by quite elderly figures for a long time, the sons of Ibn Saud, someone who was born in the 19th century. And just a few years ago, they went from that generation, people who were the sons of a guy from the 19th century, people in their 80s and 90s, down to a guy in his 30s. This is a guy who could be the leader of the country for 50 years. He is the crown prince, but because of his father's health issues, he's acting as the day-to-day leader of the country. When his father passes on, he will succeed him in all likelihood as the king, and then can lead for decades and decades to come. So him as a person, him as an actor, it's very important. And the United States need to assess the relationship with Saudi Arabia, recognizing that this man that they're dealing with could very well be leading the country for the rest of our lives. So is he a reliable actor? That's the question. And, what do we know? Let's look at what we know. Prince Mohammed, when he came into this position, when he came into this powerful position as the crown prince, acting leader, he went on some very erratic, dangerous, risky endeavors. And it's not only the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, which the U.S. intelligence services attributed to him personally, but it's a number of other things too. It's the escalation of the war in Yemen, which Saudi Arabia are now trying to get out of, but which really kind of initiated under his guidance. It was the rounding up of elite figures, businessmen, princes in the kingdom, locking them into hotel rooms at the Ritz-Carlton and forcing them to turn over their assets, and according to many reports, torturing many of these people. That's something that for American businesses, is quite concerning. If you want to think about the reliability of doing business in a country, you wouldn't want that to be a country in which leading businessmen were rounded up, trapped in a hotel, and tortured until they signed away their assets, would you? Another risky scheme that Prince Mohammed went on at that period was the apparent kidnapping of the prime minister of Lebanon, Saad Hariri, who was invited to go on a desert safari with the prince and was then apparently forced into filming what looked like a hostage video, resigning from his office. And only when the French negotiated was he released from Saudi Arabia, got a chance to go to France, and rescinded his resignation, which very strongly suggests that it was not done at his own will. All of these things suggest an erratic, unreliable leader, and it has been a matter of concern for the United States. But in recent years, especially in the last 2 years since President Biden was elected, the prince has been trying to signal that he is a more reliable actor. He has been backing off some of the more erratic things. There's a lot of questions about the extent to which he's done that and the extent to which his behavior and personality have really changed. But it's something that he's very much trying to project. And the fact that he is embarking on these negotiations to normalize with Israel and make these deals with the American side, while a Democrat is in office, while Joe Biden is in office, does mean something. It does suggest that he's at least trying to indicate that his relationship with the United States is not entirely dependent on who is in power at any given time, that he doesn't want to take on the role of a fully polarized partisan figure in the way that, for example, Netanyahu has, but that he could be a reliable partner of the United States no matter what's happening in American domestic politics. But all of these things are up for discussion.
So then, John, let's get into these actual concessions. So from the articles I've read, the two headline concessions that are potentially being asked for by Saudi Arabia from the United States seem rather steep to me. One being the United States, not only condoning, but supporting domestic nuclear energy program is how Saudi Arabia would characterize it. So the development of nuclear power plants in Saudi Arabia. And then the second that I have seen would be some type of joint defense treaty, which potentially would have to go through the United States Senate for ratification. So are those two things legitimately being asked for? Is there anything smaller that they're also asking for that's also significant? And when the top two headlines that I just pointed out, are those more just bargaining chips?
No, Justin, I think you have put your finger on the two major components of the shape of a deal as it's been reported on. Something else that's been discussed is the lifting of some restrictions on arms transfers to Saudi Arabia. That's another kind of piece of this. But if you're looking at the big items, those are the two things to look at. There's the nuclear energy piece, and then there's the potential for a joint security deal. Both of these are extraordinarily sensitive, and both of them risk engulfing the United States in Middle East conflict in a way that the last 3 U.S. presidents have indicated very strongly that they hope to avoid. Anyone listening to this who remembers the Iraq War and the sense of exhaustion on the U.S. side after the Iraq War, and remembers how Presidents Biden, Trump, and Obama all talked about that period and their interest in moving away from security commitments and being dragged into conflicts in the Middle East. If you can recall that, it's really so incredible to think that the United States could be elevating its relationship with Saudi Arabia in this way and making these kinds of commitments to the Saudi side. The nuclear matter we should talk about, because this has been a very sensitive issue in U.S.-Saudi relations. When Donald Trump was president, there was reporting that indicated that some of his key personnel were involved in a plan to transfer the very highest level of nuclear technology over to the Saudi side. This was Mike Flynn and Tom Barak and a couple others. They were trying to build these nuclear reactors in Saudi and to waive some of the restrictions that the U.S. puts on these technology transfers that would perhaps make it more likely that Saudi Arabia could get a nuclear bomb, a nuclear weapon, not just nuclear civilian energy, but a weapon. And the way Prince Mohammed has talked about this is also instructive because he's been asked point blank, including in the interview with Brett Baer for Fox that we were talking about earlier this evening, that he could be interested in pursuing a nuclear weapon. He's acknowledged this. And in a way, it's kind of refreshing because of how so many other countries that are, in fact, known to be pursuing nuclear weapons have tried to deny it and claim that it's only for civilian use. We can all understand his calculus, and he's willing to talk about it in those terms. The Iranians, the major security rival of Saudi Arabia, the major risk to Saudi Arabia, the major threat to Saudi Arabia, they're getting closer to getting a nuclear weapon. So it makes sense that the Saudis would want the same. And this is how you get a dangerous arms race, like what we had with India, Pakistan, where two countries that are so antagonistic and continue to be on the precipice of conflict, both end up with weapons that could destroy what we know as civilization in the human race. It's a remarkable and concerning thing. And the perspective that you have about the nuclear deterrent and its value will inform the way that you think about these things. Some of the countries that do have nuclear weapons, always reliable actors, North Korea, Iran, nearly, Israel, Pakistan, and India.
Russia.
Exactly, yeah. Another country with a leader that we've been describing earlier this evening as erratic, sometimes unreliable, sometimes quite hawkish, getting a nuclear weapon, it's a concerning matter. And it's something that he's, like we've said, acknowledged that he might be interested in.
So it's a useless effort to reach a nuclear weapon because you cannot use it. If you use it, you got to have a big fight with the rest of the world.
If they get one, will you?
If they get one, we have to get one.
From my perspective, John, I place great value in nuclear deterrence, but that's only one side of the equation, right? Nuclear deterrence is thought to prevent maybe direct conflict between two nations. However, when you have more nuclear proliferation, there's just more chances for mishaps. There could be a technological malfunction. There could be espionage efforts or corruption, and therefore proliferation of nuclear weapons or dirty bombs to outside actors like terrorist organizations. There's always a potential for regime change. And then what happens for nuclear weapons? Nuclear weapons technology systems, in addition to just a tech glitch, are very costly to maintain, and they need to be maintained at very high levels.
Some of these risks are not even about nuclear weapons. They're even just about the civilian technology. A meltdown, for example. Unless you have a very high standard, it can be a pretty significant risk. And the Saudi economy is in this development process. I'm not really in a position to say exactly whether they are ready to be trusted with such a serious management matter. We've seen some mismanagement on Saudi projects in the past, like Live Golf and Neom, and you can imagine the people running Live Golf being entrusted with a nuclear power plant.
You just hit your head on maybe the biggest threat that I just accidentally left out: human error. We have had major standards, John, in the United States forever, and we had 3 Mile Island and other examples of meltdowns caused by our own incompetence, where the computer system was reading, turn this thing down, and the operator, who was tired at the end of a shift, kept turning it up. That's another consideration.
But you're talking about the possibility that the Saudi regime could collapse, and this is something that we know that people on the U.S. side have expressed concern about. When President Obama was president in particular, this was concurrent with the Arab Spring. Like I was saying, people were waiting for the next Arab regime to fall at that time. It seemed like it was spreading like wildfire. And the Obama administration, people in the National Security Council, they were saying that they thought the Saudi system, the Saudi kingdom, only had 15 years left before it collapsed. I mean, that I think was probably far too pessimistic. I'm more optimistic that the Saudi kingdom can persist. But I mean, you think about that. I mean, that's a level of concern with people who are really read up on this. And, the people that we trust with our security, we're expressing this. And we're also talking about how even Prince Mohammed himself is concerned that this could happen. I mean, we were talking at the beginning about why are they interested in, combating political Islam and aligning more with the Israelis on these security matters, and they're worried about the Iranian threat. I mean, they're worried about their security. They feel a very acute sense of risk that their system could collapse. So it's something they're concerned about too. So, I mean, if the system did collapse and you had nuclear weapons milling about, I mean, that's concerning. But what have the Saudis said about these kinds of risk and this hesitancy on the U.S. side? They've said, look, we're offering you basically right of first refusal. You're our preferred partner in the nuclear issue, Americans. But if you don't help us on upgrading our civilian nuclear technology and potential path to a nuclear weapon, we'll go elsewhere. Like I said, they've been talking to the Chinese. They've been working with them on lots of economic matters, but also increasingly on some political and security issues. They have relations with the Russians. You could assess them differently, whether those are really warm relations or not. Historically, they haven't been. They've gotten a little bit warmer, but that's another partner that would be eager to work with Arab countries on a deeper level than they have now. And these countries have been taking themselves a riskier approach to these matters recently as well. So they're saying, if we don't get this from you, we'll go elsewhere. And that is an interesting threat to make. Can the United States give into a kind of nuclear blackmail like that? I mean, what kind of precedent does that set? Could every country then say the same thing? Turkey, another country that if Iran got a nuclear weapon would probably want to have one. What about Egypt? What if Egypt said that the same thing? If you don't give us nuclear technology, we're going to go to the Chinese and Russians. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. How do you stop that once you kind of give in to those arguments?
Really hard. Do we know if Saudi Arabia is 100% committed right now to getting a nuclear weapon, or, for example, would preventing Iran from having nuclear capabilities be enough? So, for example, could the United States work some backroom deals with Israel to delay any type of breakout time for nuclear weapons by Iran? And would that satisfy Saudi Arabia?
I'm not really sure about the Saudi appetite for a preemptive strike on Iran. I think that they recognize how risky that would be and how damaging it would be to the security of the region, how much it would put their own country at risk, especially at a time when they don't yet have the kinds of security guarantees from the Americans that they're looking for here. Saudi Arabia feel very much under siege and at risk from all of these Iranian pressures that we've been describing. In 2019, they were attacked by the Iranians at their oil facilities. This is something that was a huge, huge event in the kingdom and their perception of their own security. They've been attacked from Yemen by the Houthis. The Houthis are the rebel group that Saudi Arabia have been engaging in war with in Yemen, and that has spilled over into Saudi Arabia and also into the UAE. It hasn't been contained to Yemen itself, but it's been a security issue even domestically for these countries. Missiles being fired from Yemen into Saudi territory, into Emirati territory. And the pattern that I've kind of noticed is that whenever the prospect of real escalation with the Iranians comes up, the Saudis and the rest of the Arab side, they become more reluctant to engage and escalate because at various times, the Saudis and Emiratis have encouraged the U.S. to take escalating steps against the Iranians. But then when they seem to be at risk of being drawn into this, they move to take down the temperature. And that's kind of what happened with this deal that they made under the auspices of the Chinese and Iraqis and renormalizing ties with Iran. So I do not know what appetite they would have for a preemptive strike. But what have they said? What Prince Mohammed said in his interview with Bret Baier, if the Iranians get a bomb, we have to get a bomb. So they've made that clear. They would respond to the Iranian nuclear accession with an interest in duplicating that on their side. So there would be mutually assured destruction. There would be mutual deterrence. That's the framework that we have seen explicitly laid out by the Saudi side.
So then on to that joint defense agreement, what would that look like? And I would understand that would have to go through Congress because it sounds like it would be a formal treaty. So can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was an article recently, I think it was earlier this week or last week, I believe it was in the New York Times, about what the Saudis are really looking for here in a security agreement with the states. So what this article suggested was the Saudis aren't looking for a NATO-style security guarantees necessarily. That's the strongest level of U.S. alliance, right? Instead, the Saudis would be looking to model their security guarantees on agreements that the U.S. have made with Japan and South Korea, which are still very, very strong, but not quite as strong as NATO. However, this would certainly create the possibility that the United States would be called on to defend the Saudis, that American soldiers would have to fight and die to defend the kingdom. And this would have to go through Congress. This would only have value to the Saudis if it was a treaty. We've been talking about how Democratic and Republican administrations, especially in recent years, have been treating the Saudis differently and have viewed the Saudi relationship in a different way. I mean, more recently, the Biden administration have been kind of warming the ties with the Saudis, but Biden ran for president saying that he wanted to make Saudi a pariah state. What if the Americans did get a president who really followed through on that? What if someone like Chris Murphy, a real skeptic on Saudi Arabia, became president? What if someone of the ilk of Bernie Sanders became president? Not him himself, he's too old now, but some of the people that he's inspired, people like Ocasio in the progressive movement. What if someone like that became president? Saudi Arabia certainly couldn't rely on a strong U.S. partnership at that point. How about the pattern that the Americans have taken, not just in the last few years, but across their history of making non-treaty level agreements and then backing off of them after an election? We did see this with Trump, who discarded the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, who discarded the American participation in the non-binding Paris Agreement. But we've also seen it again and again and again in other circumstances. The United States organizing the effort to create the International Trade Organization and then not taking part of it. The United States organizing the effort to create the League of Nations and then not taking part in it. The United States advocating that other countries recognize Taiwan and not doing so. The United States advocating that other countries sign the Law of the Sea Treaty and not doing so. We see this whiplash. We see a kind of hypocrisy on the American side. And the Saudis, of course, recognize this. And the Saudis would never believe that they had a real security guarantee with the United States unless it was treaty enforced. So any deal of this nature would have to get Senate ratification if it's going to have any value at all. And that's really brings a whole another set of actors into this picture who are the United States Senate.
Well, not only that, it brings in the United States public. So, and just to add on to your examples, especially with security issues, it's a little bit different. But even we had President Obama go on national TV saying if Syria used chemical weapons, it would be crossing a red line, which implies to many people the United States would be willing to get directly involved. And all of a sudden he flipped and folded like a cheap suit. So it makes sense that.
And that is a very, very important example, Justin. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because that's something that the Saudis and other Arabic-speaking countries absolutely remember and are definitely thinking about here. Because the effort to arm the Syrian rebels and support the Syrian rebellion and oppose Assad and try to force him out of power, this was supported by these countries like Saudi Arabia. And they believed that the United States was kind of committed to that position. And when they saw the United States back off of those kind of commitments, threats, promises, it totally changed the way that they were approaching that conflict. And now we're at a stage where those countries are actually normalizing their relations with Assad and with Syria, and have completely given up on trying to support the opposition. They've gone entirely the other direction. And they're in this situation, from their perspective, because the United States chose not to intervene and support the rebellion.
Yeah, so we are now talking about a potential treaty that it would need 2/3 of the United States Senate to support mutual defense cooperation between the United States and Saudi Arabia. This is Saudi Arabia, a country that buying up the PGA Tour, essentially, one of the lower, least popular major sporting leagues in the United States. You could argue it's 6th on the totem pole, behind football, baseball, basketball, hockey, MLS, and then you have the PGA Tour. It created a firestorm where not only were a lot of U.S. citizens very upset, folks that don't even watch golf just because Saudi Arabia was involved. John, do we really think that it is possible going into an election year for the Biden administration to essentially reverse their entire foreign policy messaging, which has been democracies versus autocracies almost, or democracies versus governments that aren't democracies. They held a summit on it. They've been talking a lot about human rights. Just throw all of that out and then try and use political capital to get Democrats and Republicans on board for something that many constituents and grassroots activists will be vehemently opposed against.
Yeah, it's an interesting position, isn't it? Because, like you said, the Biden administration look very hypocritical, and they would be making this move ahead of an election. But what I would say is that the election really is important context for why they're pursuing this in the first place. And I think the Biden administration are thinking about the Israeli part of this puzzle, knowing that the Israelis are quite popular in the United States. And like we were saying earlier, the U.S. partnership with Israel is really valued by a lot of the American electorate. And they are pursuing this partly because they believe it would be a political win in that regard. You know, a big announcement, a big initiative that they could put up as a win on the board that helps protect a country that a lot of people in the American public really care about. But it does definitely draw into question some of these major pieces of rhetoric that they've been pronouncing. Not only the promise to make Prince Mohammed a pariah, which of course has already been discarded, but the effort to shore up democracies around the world. Why is that? It's because Saudi Arabia are perceived in the United States as being kind of example A of a cartoonishly despotic monarchical system, but also because of, again, the Israeli aspect of this. Israel, as we were talking about, their government are moving in a direction that's certainly believed by many to be counter-democratic, to take away important aspects of judicial independence, and also to further encroach on the West Bank in a way that does not recognize the human rights of its inhabitants. And progressives and anti-Netanyahu and democracy campaigners inside of Israel are urging the Biden administration not to make this move at this time, not because they're opposed to Saudi normalization or to American commitments to Saudi Arabia or to Israel, but because they don't want to give Netanyahu a political win in his country, in his political system, that would help him domestically at a time when so many Israelis are out in the streets protesting the moves that he's making. So the Biden administration's commitment to support democracy abroad, it would be countered not only because of what it means about U.S.-Saudi ties, but also because of what it means about U.S.-Israeli ties. But they'll contextualize all of this as a way to combat the influence of Iran, to combat the influence of China and Russia in the Middle East. And it's all about how you rationalize and spin a move like that we can all recognize is not perfectly logically consistent.
Yeah, I gotta wonder, John, do we think through back channels, obviously there's been no reports of this in the media, nor would I really expect there to be, do we think part of Saudi Arabia's concessions could be some type of, if not explicit, implicit agreement to chill out on oil and gas prices heading into the 2024 election?
I am not sure about that. And I think that the way that the American government have politicized the oil issue has been a little bit unfortunate and not entirely accurate. I think that it's important to recognize that the number one goal of the Saudis at this time is economic development. We see all of these major economic initiatives that they've been announcing. Saudi Arabia are trying to transform their country away from being a fossil fuel dependent economy to being a diversified economy with a big tourism sector, with an entertainment sector, and so on. And in order to put the investment into the domestic economy to achieve this, they need to keep the oil prices at a certain level. It's not about U.S. domestic politics. It's really not. The prices were being kept at a certain level, not because they were trying to defeat President Biden, but because of their domestic priorities. And I don't see why that would change in the case of a three-way deal with the Israelis and with Washington, because the goals of the Saudi economy are not going to be different as a consequence of this. They're still going to want to see oil above a certain level. It doesn't necessarily have to be $100 a barrel. It's kind of getting back up to that rate again lately. They're not going to want to see the oil price go below $80 probably in any situation. So of course, President Biden and his team view domestic gasoline prices as really important for the election. They might pursue something like this, some new commitments for OPEC, at least having a voice in the OPEC discussion. But I don't really see why the Saudi calculus on that is going to change. And I think that it won't be too difficult, or at least it shouldn't be too difficult for the Saudis to explain that and to communicate that, because I think that it is quite honestly a good faith strategy that they've adopted on at least on that issue, if not on some of these other issues.
Today, Congress gave families of 9/11 victims the right to sue Saudi Arabia on the theory that the kingdom's officials might have had a role supporting the September 11th terrorists. The House followed the Senate in overriding President Obama's veto. It is the first override in his entire presidency.
Working off the premise that you're going to need 2/3 of the Senate to vote for it, I just get flashbacks, and I just think it's so unrealistic to even be talking about this in a serious way based on the flashbacks that I'm getting, which is taking you back, John, and our listeners into a time machine. Back to the spring of 2016, there was an initiative in the Senate to pass legislation that would allow families that were victims of 9/11 to basically sue Saudi Arabia. Now, during that whole debate, we got to remember that there's a presidential election raging. So the fact that the Democrats and Chuck Schumer were willing to get on board with this, and they were, despite objections from President Obama at the time, I think speaks to both a dynamic maybe in the Senate that shows some true animus and vitriol towards Saudi Arabia. Chuck Schumer went as far to override a veto by President Obama with massive majority and get this legislation through. So I just don't see, I'm unable to comprehend how such a treaty would be able to get through the Senate. You have Jared Kushner working with Republicans like Lindsey Graham to try and advance this. However, you have a whole bunch of moderate and vulnerable Democrats like Tester, like Manchin, like Sinema, and then even some progressives, for example, like Sherrod Brown, who are all up for re-election. So that complicates things. You have the progressive wing, which you had mentioned, folks like Bernie Sanders, folks like Chris Murphy, and other Democrats just fundamentally opposed to the kingdom in any type of agreement like this. Could anything theoretically get through?
Yeah, Justin, it's interesting that you mentioned that 9/11 lawsuit. And this has been a kind of bizarre subplot in U.S.-Saudi relations for a while. As I don't know if I've mentioned the show before, but I'm myself the family member of a 9/11 victim, and I've certainly never seen any compelling evidence that the king is responsible for the 9/11 attacks. I think the whole thing is a bit odd. And it is interesting that President Obama, who was really the most hated American politician in Saudi Arabia for a long time, and who had very negative feelings about Saudi Arabia himself, was trying to kind of calm down and discourage the pursuit of that measure. But the fact that there is this public dialogue around the issue, even if it doesn't seem like it should be taken quite as seriously as maybe it has been, is a good proxy for American political feeling about Saudi Arabia, which is something we've been discussing again and again as a big issue in this deal. And it does demonstrate the just incredible lack of trust that many Americans, including leading politicians, have in the kingdom, that they would suspect something that appalling and upsetting of the highest echelons of the Saudi state, that they would realistically suspect that. I mean, that demonstrates just the incredibly low regard in which so many of these figures do hold the kingdom. So it, just like you've said, it does help us understand how uphill it might be to convince many people in American politics and much of the American public to support Japanese or Korean style security treaty with the Saudis. But on the other hand, many people in American politics do have a ground in which they could try to spin this and convince themselves to vote in its favor. One of the major reasons for that is the Israeli aspect of this, which we've already talked about. The Israelis are very popular in much of the American public, but also among many key senators, very, very committed to the U.S.-Israeli partnership. And if they believe they could sell this or rationalize it as a way of defending Israel, they might be eager to support that. Also, the Republicans have a political incentive, perhaps, to support this by rationalizing it as a continuation of the so-called Abraham Accords process, which began under Trump's presidency. We know that Jared Kushner, who, like we said, has received this $2 billion investment into his firm from the Saudis under very suspicious circumstances. We've heard that he is already lobbying Republican senators to support this on that basis, that they would then celebrate it as a continuation of the Abraham Accords process. Of course, we can kind of consider him to be really an agent of Saudi Arabia in no uncertain terms because of his business relationship with them, including when he was in public office, but certainly now when he's received all of this money and investment from them. But he's actively lobbying senators on this. It's very possible that his voice will be a persuasive one to many of them. So even though it's uphill, I wouldn't say that it's impossible for this to happen. All of the actors have some reason that they might support it, whether giving Biden a win, whether giving Kushner and Trump a win, whether it's because of the Israeli commitments. There's certain ways in which you could see this happening. Also, again, that whole rationale about Russia and China and, taking a big important country away from Russia and China and getting them in the U.S. column, that's something else that's part of this discussion. So uphill, but honestly not impossible.
Yeah, and just to kind of play devil's advocate here and add another point to your scoreboard on why it's possible. If Trump actually is bought off by Saudi Arabia heading into an election, this would be the best time for a Democratic president to do this type of agreement, because not only would you probably be, shielded from any attacks from the former President Trump, but maybe he'd support it, and vociferously so, and that could add some more cover for the Republicans that might vote for this thing.
That would be if the Democratic president really wanted to do this. Because you could also say the fact that the Saudis are bribing Kushner and Trump. You could also look at that as a reason not to support it, because it would demonstrate something else that we talked about earlier in this discussion, that the Saudis shouldn't be trusted, that they're playing a subversive role in American politics. That's a pretty compelling reason not to support this. So you could see a lot of Democrats opposing it really on that basis, that why should we trust a country that's willing to corrupt our politics, that's trying to put all of this dirty money into our system. That's not an honest partner. That's not a country that, really believes in the sanctity of our legal system. That's a country that's trying to undermine the way our democracy works. That's how a lot of Democrats are going to look at this. So the fact that the Saudis have bribed Kushner, that Trump in a recent legal brief said that his properties were worth $1 billion because he believes that the Saudis would pay that amount because he knows they want to bribe him. Again, that suggests to Saudi Arabia that's playing a political role, a role that's not entirely honest, a role that's encouraging the kind of things that we've seen recently from Bob Menendez as well as Kushner and Trump. It's a reason not to support the deal.
Yeah, the Menendez thing is an interesting wrench that kind of just got thrown into everything this past week. So I guess as we're wrapping up here, what do we have to look forward to when we're reading the news? Is there any timeline? Is there any type of U.S. signal that we should be looking for that would signal that there still is momentum for this agreement? Or are we truly in a wait and see situation?
Well, the only timeline, I think, on the U.S. side is the election. I think that the people and the voices in the Biden administration who want to see this happen, and I imagine there's a lot of division inside the U.S. government about this idea. The voices who want to see this happen are probably hoping to get it done before the election because, like we were talking about, they want to put it up as a big win, a win for Israel, a win for taking this big country away from China and Russia ahead of the election. So that's the timeline that I would look for on that front. Of course, the Saudis, they can be a little bit more patient. We were talking about how Prince Mohammed is expected to lead the country for decades. So he's in no rush in that sense. Another factor on the Saudi side is his father, the king. King Salman, he is still the head of state of Saudi Arabia. He's still officially the leader of the country. He's the king. And he is understood to view these issues a little bit differently from his son. He's known to be a much stronger advocate for Palestinian welfare. And there is sometimes a sense that Prince Mohammed would actually rather wait until his father dies and the succession is formally completed before he makes a bunch of concessions and relationship building initiatives with the Israelis, because it would be considered perhaps an insult to his father's legacy to make a move that undermines the Palestinian welfare and the prospect of Palestinian statehood while his father is still king. So that's a factor. However, what we are getting is this steady drumbeat of little pieces, day by day by day. And we start off this program talking about the Israeli tourism minister who's going to visit KSA. I mean, it's just little things like this that keep happening. There's little crumbs again and again and again, and it's the steady move in this direction. Some analysts have been saying that in their point of view, Saudi Arabia and Israel have really already normalized. And all this is about working your way towards a big announcement. But there is so much momentum heading in the direction of convergence that we should expect to just see little pieces, whether or not the U.S. are ready to make big concessions.
So I guess it's stay tuned.
It's stay tuned.